3 weeks after my son begged me to co-sign his business loan, he blocked my number. I thought he was ashamed of failing. I was wrong. When a bank employee called me days later, she didn't ask whether I knew what happened. She told me I needed to see it myself. My name is Arthur Bennett. I'm 64 years old, and for most of my life, I believed hard work could solve almost anything. I owned a small precision machining business outside Columbus, Ohio. I had started it in 1991 with one used lathe, a rented garage, and a loan from my father-in-law. 35 years later, I had a comfortable home, a successful shop, and enough savings to finally stop worrying about every unexpected bill. My wife, Margaret, and I had been married for 37 years. We had 2 children. Our daughter, Emily, was 31 and worked as an emergency room nurse. She had always been responsible, careful, and independent. Our son, Ryan, was 34. Ryan was different. He was charming, ambitious, and always convinced that the next opportunity would finally change his life. He had spent years working in restaurants, eventually becoming a sous chef at an upscale restaurant downtown. Then, one evening in March, Ryan arrived at our house with his business partner, Mason Reed. They wanted to open a restaurant called Harbor and Oak. Ryan had prepared a presentation showing the building, menu concept, projected profits, and renovation plans. The restaurant would have exposed brick, wooden tables, an open kitchen, and locally sourced food. For the first time in years, I saw something in my son's eyes that looked like confidence. They needed $350,000. They had some savings and a small private investment, but the bank wanted a strong personal guarantor before approving the remaining loan. Ryan looked directly at me. "Dad, I'm not asking you for money. I just need you to put your name behind me." Margaret didn't say anything during dinner, but later that night, she sat on the edge of our bed and removed her earrings slowly. "I want to believe in Ryan," she said, "but that Mason man makes me uncomfortable." I laughed gently. "You're being protective." "Maybe," she replied. "Just be careful." 3 days later, I signed the guarantee. The bank officer explained that if the restaurant failed, my personal assets could potentially be affected. My house, my savings, even my business. I understood the words. What I didn't understand was how quickly everything would unravel. For the first several weeks, Ryan called constantly. He sent photographs of the renovation. He asked my opinion about kitchen equipment. He talked about opening night as if it were already a success. I felt proud. Then, near the end of June, the calls stopped. At first, I thought he was simply busy. Then his messages became shorter. "Can't talk, Dad. Everything's fine. Call you later." He never did. On the 12th of July, I called him repeatedly. No answer. 2 days later, I called again. This time, the phone didn't even ring. I had been blocked. I stared at the screen for several seconds. My 34-year-old son had blocked his own father, and I had no idea why. The next morning, I drove to the restaurant. I expected to see workers preparing for the grand opening. Instead, I found brown paper covering the windows, a locked door, and an overflowing dumpster. The restaurant looked abandoned. I stood there alone, staring through the glass. For the first time, I wondered whether Ryan hadn't simply failed. Maybe something much worse had happened. And 3 days later, a stranger from his bank would finally tell me exactly how bad it was. 3 days after finding the abandoned restaurant, my phone rang while I was working at the shop. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. I almost ignored it. "Mr. Bennett?" a woman asked. "My name is Claire Morgan. I'm a senior loan officer with First Heritage Bank. We spoke in April when you signed the personal guarantee for Harbor and Oak." My hand tightened around the phone. "Yes, Mr. Bennett, I need you to come to the bank today. There are documents concerning the restaurant that you need to see personally." My stomach dropped. "Is Ryan in trouble?" There was a pause. I'd rather explain everything face to face. I left the shop within minutes. At the bank, Claire was waiting in a private conference room. Beside her sat a man named Daniel Brooks from the bank's fraud department. A thick folder rested on the table. Claire pushed it toward me. "Please take your time," she said, "and stop me whenever you have questions." I opened the folder. The first pages showed the loan's payment history. The bank had approved $350,000, but the money wasn't released all at once. It was supposed to be distributed in construction stages after Ryan and Mason provided legitimate invoices. Over 10 weeks, nearly $225,000 had already been withdrawn. I looked at the photographs I'd seen from Ryan. Then I looked at the numbers. Something didn't make sense. "That restaurant isn't worth $200,000 of work," I said. Claire nodded. We reached the same conclusion. Daniel turned several pages. Most of the money was transferred to 3 vendors. One appears legitimate. The other 2 are questionable. He pointed to the first company, North Star Restaurant Supply, then the second, Reed Commercial Consulting. I stared at the name. "Reed? Mason Reed," Daniel said. My heart sank. The consulting company had been registered only months earlier. Its address was a private residence. And shortly after each loan draw, money moved from the restaurant account into accounts controlled by Mason. "How much?" I asked. "Approximately $175,000. I leaned back. For several seconds I couldn't speak. My son's business partner had apparently been moving borrowed money into his own accounts. But there was another question. What did Ryan know? Daniel looked at Claire. "We can't answer that yet." Then he showed me the signatures. Ryan had signed 8 of the loan draw requests. 8. I felt something break inside me. My first thought wasn't anger, it was disappointment. I had trusted my son. Had he really looked at my signature on that guarantee and decided to gamble with everything I owned? Claire closed the folder halfway. "There is something else." She handed me a printed email. It was from Ryan to Mason. The date was the 17th of June. I read it slowly. Ryan had compared the invoices against the actual construction work and noticed the numbers didn't match. He had asked Mason where the missing money had gone. Mason's response came minutes later. He told Ryan not to contact the bank. He called it a temporary accounting problem. I read the message again, then again. My son's name was on the page. But so was something I hadn't expected to see. Fear Ryan had discovered the problem before I ever knew anything was wrong. I looked up at Claire. "Why did you call me?" She folded her hands on the table. "Because you're the guarantor, Mr. Bennett. If this loan goes into default, you could be responsible for the consequences." She paused. "But before you make any decisions, you deserve to know the entire story." I thanked her and left the bank. When I got home, Margaret was waiting in the kitchen. She took one look at my face. "What happened?" I placed the folder on the table. For the next 20 minutes, I told her everything. When I finished, she stared at the papers. Then she whispered the words I had been trying not to hear. "I warned you about Mason." I nodded. She had, but there was still one question neither of us could answer. Why had Ryan blocked me? That night, I decided I wasn't going to guess anymore. I was going to find my son, and this time, I would hear the truth directly from him. The next morning, I called every number I had for Ryan. His cell went straight to voicemail. His apartment was empty. His friends either didn't know where he was or didn't want to tell me. I drove back to Harbor and Oak and stood outside for several minutes. The building looked even worse in daylight. A few unfinished tables sat behind the dusty windows, and construction equipment had been abandoned near the entrance. I called my oldest friend, Samuel Carter. Samuel had known me for more than 30 years and had never been afraid to tell me when I was being foolish. We met at a small diner outside town. After hearing everything, he stared at me across the table. "You need a lawyer." "I need my son." "You need both," he said. "But don't confront Ryan until you know exactly what you're dealing with." He was right. That afternoon, I hired an attorney named Laura Mitchell. Laura reviewed the bank documents and requested the complete loan file. She also told me something that changed the way I looked at the situation. Arthur, there's a difference between someone who helped commit fraud and someone who discovered fraud and panicked. Don't decide which one your son is until you have evidence. I hadn't considered that. I had been so hurt by Ryan blocking me that I had already judged him. That evening, Laura called. There's something you need to see. She forwarded me another email. It was from Ryan. The message was dated the 17th of June, the same night he'd confronted Mason. Ryan had written that he knew the invoices were false and intended to contact the bank if Mason didn't explain where the money had gone. Mason's response was threatening. He warned Ryan that if he went to the bank, everything would collapse. Worse, Mason claimed he could make it look like Ryan had knowingly participated. Ryan's signatures were already on the documents. Suddenly, his silence made more sense. He had been terrified, but I still didn't know where he was. 2 days later, Samuel called me. His nephew worked at a restaurant downtown and had heard something. Ryan had taken overnight work at a small 24-hour diner called the Copper Kettle. He was using a shortened version of his middle name on the schedule. I drove there that night. It was nearly midnight when I arrived. I sat in my truck for 15 minutes, staring through the window. Then I walked inside. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the room. And there he was. Ryan stood behind the counter, wearing a stained apron. He looked thinner, much thinner. His hair was messy, his face exhausted, and the confident man who had presented that restaurant plan at our kitchen table seemed to have disappeared. He looked up. Our eyes met. His face went pale. "Dad?" We walked outside. For nearly an hour, neither of us said much. Then Ryan started crying. "I didn't steal from you." Those were his first words. I listened. He told me everything. When he discovered Mason's scheme, he confronted him. Mason threatened him. Ryan became convinced that if he went to the bank, he would lose everything and possibly be accused of helping with the fraud. So he made the worst decision of his life. He stayed quiet. He blocked my number because every time I called, he couldn't bring himself to lie to me. He had taken the overnight job to start saving money and repay whatever part of the debt he believed he was responsible for. I looked at my son. "You should have called me." "I know." "You should have trusted me." "I know." His voice cracked. "I was ashamed, Dad." I finally put my hand on his shoulder. "We're going to fix this. But you don't have to fix it for me," he said. "I know." That mattered. I wasn't going to rescue him from every consequence, but I wasn't going to abandon him either. The next morning, Ryan met with Laura and the bank's fraud team. He gave them everything: Mons, invoices, dates, names. Within days, investigators confirmed that Mason had created fake vendor companies to divert the loan money. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was finally stronger than the fear. The investigation moved faster than any of us expected. Within a week, the bank confirmed that Mason Reed had created several fake vendor accounts. Money from Harbor and Oak had been transferred into those accounts almost immediately after each loan draw was released. The evidence was overwhelming. But there was still a problem. Ryan had signed the documents. Laura explained that his signatures did not automatically make him guilty, especially now that he was cooperating and had evidence showing he had challenged Mason before the money disappeared. Still, consequences remained. The bank froze the remaining loan funds and demanded a complete accounting. I spent hours with Laura reviewing every invoice, every transfer, and every construction payment. Eventually, we determined that approximately $175,000 had been diverted. Another $75,000 had been spent legitimately on the restaurant. The rest of the approved loan had never been released. I had feared losing everything. Now, at least, that possibility was disappearing. But I didn't want Ryan to walk away thinking everything had been solved for him. I sat with him at my kitchen table. "You made mistakes," I told him. He nodded. "You trusted the wrong person." Another nod. "And you waited too long to tell me." His eyes dropped. "I know. You're going to have to take responsibility for that." "I will." That was the conversation we needed. Not anger, not excuses. Responsibility. Mason was eventually arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and forgery. Investigators also discovered that he had used a similar scheme against another business owner several years earlier. He had simply found a new partner and changed the company name. The bank agreed to restructure the legitimate portion of the loan. Because of the fraud investigation and Ryan's cooperation, my personal guarantee was reduced significantly. It was still painful, but it wasn't the financial disaster I had feared. Ryan sold his expensive car and took 2 jobs. During the day, he worked in another restaurant kitchen. At night, he returned to the Copper Kettle. For months, he used the bus because every dollar mattered. I didn't pay his remaining debt. I could have, but I knew that wouldn't help him. Instead, I sat beside him once a week and helped him organize his finances. He paid his share slowly, month after month, dollar after dollar. And something unexpected happened. The more responsibility he accepted, the more I began trusting him again. Not because he promised to change, because he actually changed. One evening, while reviewing old messages for the investigation, I found something I'd completely forgotten. It was a message from my daughter, Emily. She had sent it the night before I signed the guarantee. "Dad, please be careful with Mason. Something about him doesn't feel right." I stared at those words for a long time. I had answered her with one sentence. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I know what I'm doing." I felt ashamed. Emily had tried to protect me. I simply hadn't wanted to hear anything that threatened my son's dream. A few days later, I invited her and her husband, Daniel, to dinner. After we ate, I apologized. "I should have listened to you." Emily smiled sadly. "You wanted to help Ryan." "I did. And that's not wrong, Dad." She paused, but helping someone doesn't mean ignoring every warning. Her words stayed with me. That night, I realized something. I had spent my entire life believing that loving your children meant protecting them from consequences. Maybe I had misunderstood. Sometimes love meant standing beside them while they faced those consequences themselves. Ryan was learning that lesson. So was I. Months have passed since the night I found Ryan working at the Copper Kettle. Harbor and Oak never opened. The unfinished restaurant was eventually sold, and the lease was transferred to another business. Mason's legal case is still moving through the courts, and investigators have connected him to other victims. As for Ryan, he is rebuilding his life. He still works in a restaurant kitchen, but now he approaches everything differently. He checks contracts carefully. He asks questions. He keeps records. Most importantly, he no longer believes that admitting a problem makes him weak. He once told me that blocking my number was the biggest mistake he made. I told him the bigger mistake was believing he had to face everything alone. He didn't need to protect me from the truth. He needed to trust me enough to tell it. Our relationship isn't exactly what it was before. In some ways, it's better. Before all this happened, I thought being a good father meant saying yes whenever my children needed me. Now, I understand that love needs boundaries. Trust needs honesty, and helping someone doesn't mean taking responsibility for every decision they make. My daughter, Emily, taught me that lesson long before I was ready to hear it. She never demanded anything from me. She simply warned me when she thought I was making a mistake. I ignored her because I wanted Ryan's dream to succeed. Today, I listen. A few months after the investigation began, Emily told me about an idea she had been quietly developing. She wanted to help create a small community medical center for families who couldn't afford private health care. She had talked about it for years, but never asked me for money. This time, I offered to help her build a realistic plan. Not because I owed her, not because she had saved me, because I believed in her, and because she had earned my trust long before she ever needed anything from me. Margaret and I also changed the way we handle our finances. We updated our estate plans. We created clearer protections for both children. We learned to ask more questions before signing anything. It wasn't about choosing one child over another. It was about making sure love never again replaced common sense. Sometimes, I still think about that afternoon at First Heritage Bank. I remember Claire sliding the folder across the table. I remember seeing Ryan's signatures. I remember believing, for one terrible night, that my own son had betrayed me. But I also remember something more important. I didn't know the truth yet. I had allowed fear to write a story before I had all the facts. That's the mistake I will never make again. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Don't confuse silence with betrayal. Don't confuse fear with guilt. And never let love convince you that asking questions means you love someone less. Ryan is still my son. He made serious mistakes, but he faced them. He is paying his debts, rebuilding his reputation, and earning back trust one decision at a time. And every Sunday now, he comes to our house for dinner. Sometimes we talk about work. Sometimes we argue about football. Sometimes we sit around the kitchen table without saying much at all, but his phone stays on the table. His number is no longer blocked. And when I look across at him, I don't see the son who nearly destroyed everything. I see the son who finally learned how to tell his father the truth. And I realize that sometimes the hardest family lessons are the ones that save a family from breaking forever.